Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this conversation with Byron Borger. I'm glad that you're here with us. I'm Jeff Crosby, the author of World of Wonders, A Spirituality of Reading. And it's my delight to welcome Byron Borger, a long-term friend and bookseller from Dallastown, Pennsylvania, for tonight's conversation. Before we begin, I want to thank the people of Paraclete Press, and particularly Lexa Hale and the IT director at Paraclete Press named Sarah, who have helped facilitate making this happen. So thanks very much, Paraclete Press. By day, I'm the president of ECPA, a trade association of Christian publishing. I often say from AMG publishers to Zondervan. And um, but before, I was a bookseller for a long time in Bloomington, Indiana. It was then that I met this gentleman, Byron Borger. He opened his store in 1982, the year before my wife and I did. And it became a shining light for me and still is to this day, one of the best booksellers in the entire country. And I was glad when Byron said he would love to host this conversation. As I recall, the first book that Byron and his wife Beth, who run the store in central Pennsylvania, ever sold was Victor Hugo's Les Mis. And I think that tells you a lot about the person who's going to be interviewing me this evening. So, Byron, I'm going to turn it over to you. If the attendees would use the chat to ask us questions throughout the hour, we'll get to as many of those as we can. But Byron, welcome and thank you for hosting the conversation.
Well, Jeff, congratulations on the book. It releases officially tomorrow.
Right.
Those that have pre-ordered it from Hearts and Minds here in South Central Pennsylvania have probably already gotten it, but it is officially being launched. So in a certain sense, this is a party. So if anybody's at home, celebrate a little bit, get your favorite beverage, take a hat tip to Jeff and to Paraclete, because Paraclete did a really nice job with this, and we are wanting to echo what Jeff said. Thanks to Paraclete for making this happen. Jeff has been a longtime friend and an encouragement. We had started our store, and indeed, we didn't know what we were doing. We worked in campus ministry for a good number of years, and I used books in ministry, helping students especially develop a Christian perspective in their careers, in their majors, their vocations. And as we did that, people said, "You ought to have a bookstore. You're always making us read books." So we had a baby and moved home to South Central Pennsylvania. We're in a little town called Dallastown. I do a newsletter every week called Book Notes. And we were happy to review Jeff's first book when it came out on Broadleaf, The Language of the Soul, just a wonderful, wonderfully written book. But we've known him even before that. And he's the kind of guy that has been a real encouragement to us, has visited our store, has been supportive over the years, and a real leader in our industry. So before we talk about the book, Jeff, I think maybe you only gave the briefest introduction to yourself. I'd like to invite you to tell us more about your work in the book industry. You work for this trade association now. You used to be a
Yep.
bookseller. You've done just about everything in the book industry. How have you come before being a writer? Were you a reader and an industry person? Tell us about your connection to the bookstore world.
Yeah, well, growing up, I wasn't much of a reader. In the introduction to World of Wonders, I talk about how I loved reading sports biographies and I loved reading the Sunday comics in the Indianapolis Star, Beetle Bailey and Snuffy Smith and things like that. But I wasn't a voracious reader in the same way my wife was as she was growing up. But a particular book, I talk about it in that introduction that I saw on a television program, something just captivated me. It was a book called The Admiral's Daughter, a memoir of a Ukrainian woman searching for her American naval biological father that she never knew. And I think it was the world that it opened up to me. But something just captivated me. I got it, read it, and that like a light switch turned on and I began reading much, much more intentionally, and ultimately culminating in shortly after graduating from university, Cindy and I reopening a Logos bookstore near the Indiana University campus, trying to do similar things to what you and Beth were attempting to do with university students. From there, I worked at Ingram Book Company, which is the largest wholesale distributor in the world of books. And then
We order from
24,
them almost every day.
I'm sure you do.
We
Yeah.
and so that's huge. For those that don't know, this is a major distributor of books to bookstores. So you worked for the wholesale Ingram people.
Yeah, yeah, heading up their called Ingram Christian Resources Division. And then after that, 24 years at InterVarsity Press, which I know is a publisher, Byron, that you and Beth really appreciate. And about 5 years ago, had an opportunity to move from the publisher role at IVP into the trade association role. And I think my motivation in doing that was I love building bridges between people. That is one of my primary identities. And so building bridges between these disparate publishers by heading up this trade association. It's been a joy to do that. So, but all along, I was a writer. I studied journalism, and I write to know what I think, and to some extent, I write to know even what I believe. But most of the writing work I did was more journalistic. It was the trade. You may have read some of my stories in Publishers Weekly or Christian Retailing or Bookstore Journal and things like that. And I kind of set aside the dream of writing books throughout those years as a publisher when I was making decisions literally every week about what books would and wouldn't be published. But as I made my way from IVP to ECPA, it was kind of like space opened up to finally pursue these three ideas that I had, and World of Wonders was the second of the three.
Do you want to tell us what the next one's going to be?
The third, so the first was the language of the soul that you mentioned, World of Wonders, and then the third is called The Spirit in the Sky, the Power of Music in Our Search for Graceland. Chapter one is on Paul Simon. Chapter 17 is Marvin Gaye, and there's a bunch of artists in between, kind of looking at how their spirituality informed their art, not necessarily all Christian spirituality, but how religious thought informed their art. And so that's coming a year from now from Bloomsbury Publishing.
That's remarkable. And you and I have a very similar musical tastes. We overlap a lot and often exchange Facebook posts about fun music we're listening to.
That's
But
true.
but you're a book lover. And so let's talk a little bit about this book. You said you didn't read a lot growing up. I read sports biographies and the comics as well. And then there was one biography that affected me. About the hemophiliac journey of Alexander the Great. Remember that whole Nicholas, and for some reason, I read this odd memoir that a young boy wouldn't typically read, and it opened up a world and changed my life to become
That's
more of a
amazing.
reader. So I get it how a memoir or a biography can really do that for people. Um, I have to ask right from the start. I know I'm not the only one that wants to know this. The book World of Wonders: A Spirituality of Reading. Speaking of music, there's a great album by the Canadian rock star Bruce Cockburn called World of Wonders. Did you name this book because of Bruce Cockburn?
Yeah, it certainly was in the back of my mind. Yeah, I know that recording well, and Call It Democracy and all those songs on that. But really, it was more about how the process of reading, the process of becoming a reader, threw open the sashes of windows
Yeah.
and helped me see things that I think otherwise I probably wouldn't have seen. I think that for me, traveling and reading are the two things that have just opened incredible windows. Music too, but I would say traveling and reading and meeting people either literally as I traveled around the world for IVP or through the pages of their book. So it was more about that than Coburn, but yeah, it was a little bit in the back of my mind.
You have to at least mention that.
Yeah,
You mentioned connecting people. And of course, one of the sections, maybe we'll talk about it in a minute. One of the sections in your book is about memoir and the power of
mhm.
reading, how some people narrate their lives. Now, that's almost a spiritual discipline. You use that language throughout the book. Tell us a little bit about why reading is not just opening windows to help you understand things better, but as a Christian, why it is sort of a practice, a habit that transforms the heart. Is it a spiritual practice? You say that in the beginning of the book. Tell us a little about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can read to be entertained, and that's fine. I think we can read to be informed, and that's really important. But I think if we think about cultivating a reading life that is a part of spiritual practices, in the same way that prayer or fasting or solitude and silence are, I think if we approach it that way as a means of transformation, I'm not the first one to suggest that it is or can be a spiritual discipline, but I certainly believe that. In fact, if you go back to 1978, when one of the very first works of what I would call spiritual formation that I ever read, it was Richard Foster's Celebration of Discipline. I'm sure you sold many copies over the years. He has a chapter on study. So he doesn't label it reading, but he labels it study. And I think what I'm suggesting here is something akin to that, that we develop a habit of reading, and through that we open the possibility of God to enter and do transformative work. So we're inviting through our reading life something like that. Now, I go to Captiva Island every 2, 3 years with my wife and children and their children. And I'll take along a Nicholas Sparks novel, or a David Baldacci novel, always Grisham if he has something new. And I'm mostly just wanting to sort of escape and have fun and enter into a story. But what I'm suggesting in World of Wonders is something a little deeper than that.
Yeah. And to be honest, I think in your book, you make a good case for this, but I want to say it clearly too, that there is not necessarily a dichotomy between, oh, reading for fun and reading for formation, because those novels that you read for fun can in fact shape you deeply under the hood in the imaginative recesses of our heart and change who we are. So you
Yeah.
have a whole chapter on novels. You want to talk about that a little bit? Is
Yeah.
it just you
Well,
read spiritual stuff for formation that's more serious, and then you
yeah.
read getaway books for fun? I don't think you view it that way as two separate things. Reading novels and poetry can themselves be transformative from the inside out, right?
You're,
Talk
you're,
about that a little bit.
you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, a novel, I wouldn't say necessarily that I read for fun, but read just out of some deep interest was Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and I would say it's the single most impactful novel I've ever read. I remember it was when my son Dustin was very young. I think still in a bassinet, and I was reading it. I get to this section of that novel which is massive, so it's not something you're going to read overnight or over a weekend. But I got to the section on the Grand Inquisitor, and I remember uh, beginning to weep, literally weep. And my wife was, next to me, and the little boy was in the bassinet, and I remember her waking up, thinking something terrible had happened. I said, "Oh no, no, I just read a passage called the Grand Inquisitor, and I'll be fine. Go back to sleep." So yes, there isn't a dichotomy, and hopefully that's not what anyone heard, but it is kind of an additive thing to think about it, whether it is reading novels or poetry or memoir, or one of the chapters I have, diverse voices,
Yeah.
books or writers that you may read knowing that their view of the world is likely quite different from yours, but how much we can learn, how much we can gain from reading books that aren't necessarily just reinforcing what we already believe. So, another novel or series of novels that I talk about in the chapter on reading fiction is by Kenta Ruff. Books Plain Song and Benediction and Eventide. And during the early part of the pandemic in 2020, I lost the ability for a period of time to read nonfiction. Literally, all I could read for a period of time was fiction and poetry, and the Psalms. That was the other thing. And Kent Hureff's books were just incredible companions. It was the world that he cast out in Holt, Colorado, as I recall. The world he cast, and these brothers in, I think it was in Plainsong, these two farmer brothers, and their relationship to each other, and their relationship to their little community, and a young woman in a particular need. So yeah, I mean those aren't what we would call Christian fiction, but my goodness, the beauty and the truth and the art of it all just
Yeah.
it kept me going in the
Yep.
spring of 2020.
Yeah. I have a customer that early on in our bookstore work in the 80s would read Wendell Berry novels. The first Wendell Berry novel I ever read was Memory of Old Jack. It's set in one day of old Jack's life. And he came into the store, this customer did, and we were talking Wendell Berry novels, and there weren't too many novels then. Jayber Crow had not come out yet, Hannah Coulter had not come out yet. But we were talking about early Wendell Berry work, and he said, if you like Wendell Berry, you'd like Plainsong and
Oh my,
Evensong, Plainsong by
I can
Kent
see
Harif.
that.
And he said, these kind of go together, and became a Harif fan then right away as well. These rural communities,
Yeah.
slow, caring relationships. Are you a Wendell Berry fan? Do you like his novels?
Yeah, I like his poetry more,
Yeah,
but the Jayber Crow was probably an exception of digging into that, but mostly
yeah.
the poetry. Yeah.
Oh, he's very well known for his poetry. And I think Hannah Coulter, which is about a woman, an old lady, is better than Jayber Crow. Although
Yeah.
Jayber Crow is one of my all-time favorite novels as well. You have a list of 15 novels at the end of that chapter. For those that don't know yet, in this book, every chapter has a bibliography behind it. And he gives just 15 books, which is plenty to whet your appetite, whether they're books about grief, whether they're books about diversity, whether they're books about following the liturgical year. You have these different topics, and you give a bibliography at the end of each. And I hear you're working on an online, maybe bibliography, a work on progress that'll be even a little more fleshed out than the things you get in the book.
Yeah, a couple of things I'm trying to do there as time permits is annotating the list. So the list just have the title, the author,
Yeah.
maybe the publisher, I'm not sure. I think the
No.
title and author. And I'd like to annotate it with who the publisher is, the year it was published, and a sentence.
Yeah.
Why did I choose that from everything I could have chosen? The second thing I'd like to do is to add. We had to stop at a particular moment in time
Yep.
when
Yep.
the manuscript was due to Paraclete, but I'd like to keep it alive. So, for example, in the chapter on reading diverse voices, I just finished a book called The Barn, which is a work of history on the murder of Emmett Till in
Yep.
1955
Yep.
in,
Yep.
in rural Mississippi. And had I read The Barn before I turned in the manuscript, it would definitely have been one of the 15 on reading diverse voices. So I'd like to add to the list, kind of keep it evergreen, and that would be at jeffreycrosby.net. That's the website, and there will be some things coming there, but I'm just not sure when.
So people should keep their eyes on jeffreycrosby.net. But in the meantime, the 15 bibliographies in here over about 12 chapters. That's a lot of books. And they're all highly recommended by Jeff. And I concur with most of them. Some of them I don't know, but most of them I do. You know what? Not to toot my horn, Jeff, but I was doing a workshop with a group of pastors on why they should read widely. And I focused particularly on memoir and fiction, a little bit of poetry. And I couldn't help myself, but I developed a handout, which I eventually put on our store's website, of 50 novels that Christian could read with an annotated one sentence or two about each one. So I did 50 novels and 50 memoirs Not necessarily my favorite, but obviously they tend to be the favorite ones Beth and I
Right.
really like the most. So if you want to get started beyond Jeff's great one, at Hearts and Minds at our website, I have 50 novels and 50 memoirs that can just be transformative and really help you get a glimpse into the world of wonder that we live in.
Yeah,
Well,
well,
let's
all
talk
of
about the
you,
structure of the book a little bit, Jeff. You have it in three parts, right? Do you want to tell
yeah.
us sort of the three units? It's the first part, I think you call it laying the foundation.
Yeah, the first part, laying the foundations, it kind of asks the question, why should we read at all? And then from there, reading as a spiritual discipline, I share some stories, not only my own, but others, and practices and pathways of how we can cultivate that. And then the third and the first section is reading scripture as a spiritual discipline. Again, stories, practices, and pathways. So that forms the first section. And in every chapter, as you may have seen, Byron, I invited other writers. Obviously, working in the world of books for 42 years, you meet a few people. And I thought I'd love to give over some of the space to other writers, most of whom are much better known than I am, to um, to share their own brief, like 150, 200 words story about that chapter. Like,
Yeah.
so Ward or Ben Patterson writes about memoir, and each chapter has someone like that. Lucy Shaw does the
Lucy Shaw,
poetry.
poetry. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then the middle section I call the wide, wide, wonderful world of reading, the power of story, which is reading fiction. We talked about the power of paying attention, which is reading poetry, the power of perspective, which is reading diverse voices, and the power of reflection, which is reading memoir.
Yeah.
And the final section, which may be my favorite, is reading through the seasons of life and seasons of faith. So family life, grief and loss, doubt and fear, the liturgical year, and seasons of wonder and discovery. So yeah, my mind thinks in threes. The language of the soul also had three
Yeah.
sections,
Yeah.
but the music book doesn't. It just has 17 chapters.
Yeah. Well, I love the way you broke it up. In the first part, one comment came in from a guy on the chat here that said this first part about studying and Richard Foster's commitment to using books as a spiritual discipline, it reminded him of an old classic called The Love of Learning and the Desire for God by Jean Leclerc. Do you know that? He's an old
Yep.
Benedictine, I think, a
Yep.
classic, sort of heavy book, but a wonderful way into the life of the mind and the life of the soul and reading as a spiritual discipline. So one comment there kind of underscored that. But that first part, reading as a spiritual discipline, you tell stories, you tell your own stories, and then when you said you have these extra people that write a bit, one of the guys in the chapter on reading scripture, which I thought was really good, by the way. There's lots of books on reading the Bible. This one chapter was really good. Is Gregory Clapper. I think
Yeah.
that's who you have contribute to that little part. That was a very nice little essay. But he shows up later when you talk about his book. Is it the same guy around the section of grief?
You are a very attentive reader, Mr.
Well,
Borger. Yeah.
Well, you tell these stories about the book, and one of the things that's so charming about this is that it is not just you should read books. Here's why you should read books. It's almost like a memoir where you're entering these stories and inviting people to listen in over your shoulder to the habits of heart that developed as you
Yeah.
engage these books. And the part about grief and loss was really wise, and it's something I sometimes say to customers here. I had an experience where my dad was killed in a car wreck, obviously very suddenly. He was actually had just dropped off some books for us at the local post office to send to Eugene Peterson, who was a devout, loyal, zealous customer of ours, Peterson was. And dad then was driving with my mom, and some guys were speeding and hit him, and he died. Well, I didn't want to read any books on grief at all. I had no energy to read. I didn't want to read. It's my solace, it's my pastime. It was the oddest time in my life because I didn't want to read anything. But I had read some books on grief, mostly through the eyes of other customers, to prepare yourself to share what's good with people that are hurting. I had read probably 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 books on grief when I didn't need them. And so you
Yeah.
could draw on those before you need them. And so I recommend that people read books on grief and loss And you had done that. You tell the story of reading a Clapper book. You were on vacation, you ordered it, and you
Yeah.
came up with some bad news with your wife's cancer, and yet you
Yeah.
had that book under your belt. Can you mind telling us just a little bit that
No,
story in the book?
I'd be happy to. Thank you for asking. Yeah. Gregory Clapper was a chaplain in the National Guard in Iowa when some of you may remember a United Airlines jet from Denver to Chicago. It crashed on the runway. It had an emergency landing at Sioux City Airport in Iowa. And you would have thought that everyone on the plane, it just broke into three parts and everyone on the plane would have had to have died, but in fact there were some survivors. But Gregory Clapper was the chaplain of the National Guard. He was among the first on the scene. And over the course of quite some time, he cared for the survivors as well as the families of the deceased. And I love reading about aviation, so I fly a lot. And one of the ways I tend to my fear of flying is reading about aviation and aviation disasters. I know that sounds weird, but it's the truth.
It does sound
Um,
weird.
and so I read this book on that United Airlines flight, and Gregory Clapper was the first two words in the book. And it referenced a book that he wrote coming out of that tragedy. It was called When the World Breaks Your Heart. And so I ordered it. And my wife and I and our kids and grandkids went away on vacation. And while we were there, we got the news of a diagnosis, as you mentioned. And the book was, I hadn't read it yet, but the book was waiting for me on the porch when we returned on a Sunday night from that trip. And I immediately read it. And it just accompanied me, through what she and we together faced. But I am with you in reading. And the one extra thing in that is I discovered that he at the time was working with my sister on the faculty at a university in central Indiana.
Wow.
So she knew him, and through that connection, I have spent time on two occasions in Greg's home with he and his wife Jody, and have gotten to know him and appreciate him. So when I was thinking about inviting him to do, one of these vignettes at the end of a chapter, I told him what I had left and that hadn't been spoken for, and he chose reading scripture,
Wow.
and I thought he did a marvelous job. It alone is worth, I would say, 1/12 the price of the book for sure.
Yeah. His
Um,
little short piece there is very nice. But I
yeah,
really like the story of how finding this book from another book
yep,
about a tragedy, and having it just when you needed it. Just it was a beautiful story of God's serendipity and of reading a secular memoir or a secular story about an aviation disaster that
yep,
led you to this deeply Christian book published by Upper Room, as I recall.
yeah, it was.
When I didn't want to read when my dad died, um, I was telling this to a pastor friend of mine, and he reads books on grief and loss and is a tender man. And I said to him that I just didn't want to read anything about grief and stuff. And he said, well, I just came back from an event with a poet who happens to be an undertaker. And of course, that's Tom Lynch, who had written The Undertaking, which is a sort of a memoir about being a funeral director. The
Yeah,
Undertaking. It won all sorts of awards eventually. And so I said, okay, it's about death. It's about dying. It's about how you handle the body. Do you need a body to care for it? It's kind of about the world of grief, but it isn't a book of solace. It isn't designed to be given to, comfort people that are feeling loss. And so I read this memoir. I found out that he's a devout Catholic, recovering alcoholic, a deep poet, and cares deeply about the vocation of helping people through their loss. This book just changed my life. It was one of my
that's
top
amazing.
probably 10 books ever at a very moment when I could hardly read anything. So I reviewed it in my book notes then, and he saw it and he wrote me a letter So Tom Lynch, the undertaking, who knew? But
Yeah.
sometimes books just fall into your lap just at the right time that you're able to read. I saw also on your list, Jeff, you had the classic book, A Grace Disguised,
Yeah.
which is a horrific car accident and
Yeah.
one of the great books of recovering from tragedy with a devout Christian sense of discipleship in the midst of it. That's a great book too.
Yeah, and that was one I read years and years before, really
Yeah.
dealing with anything, any loss or grief of significance. So I am with you about the wisdom of of reading about grief and loss before we actually experience such things ourselves.
And I would say the same thing. Your next chapter is about doubt. And of course, these days, many people, because of some of the toxic, foolhardy stuff that's happened in conservative evangelical churches, people are throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, I don't want to be identified with the far Christian right and these churches that are covering up sex abuse and stuff. And so they're leaving the evangelical tradition, the purity culture in which they were raised, and sometimes almost going too far. And so then they're in a tragic position of what do I believe? And there's all these memoirs of people leaving the faith, some which are very tender. But again, I think people should read apologetics and doubt and the stories of doubt so you kind of know, even if you're the most confident, happy Christian in the world, not only what our other brothers and sisters might be going through to understand them, but to prepare you because you're going to hit that space sooner or later
Yeah,
in your own life. And so you might as well be prepared. So I encourage people to read books on doubt, even if they're confident, but nobody wants to. They don't believe me until they face some tragedy. And now they're like, oh, what do I read now? I'm like, hey, you should have been reading that 5 years ago. So
yeah,
doubt, you have a whole chapter on reading during times of doubt. That's
yeah.
a beautiful section of the book.
I'm glad you like that, and it's kind of wrapped around one book in particular, although there are certainly stories beyond. The book is by Daniel Taylor. It's called The Myth of Certainty, The Reflective Christian, and The Risk of Commitment, I believe is the subtitle. Just a profound part fiction, part apologetic work on this, yeah, the problem of the opportunity of doubt
Yeah.
and of the need for absolute certainty in order to move our feet forward. So it's a book that went out of print with a much larger publishing house. And one of my first acts when I went to InterVarsity Press in the fall of '97 was to say to the editorial director, I want you to bring this book back into print. And thankfully he did.
That's right.
And it's still in print. You can still order it, right?
I didn't know that was your doing. Oh, good for
Yeah.
you. He
And
orders books from us every once in a great while, and he
oh,
has some little self-published books that he's put out. And I guess you said you're helping him through a new one, right? Is there a forthcoming
well,
one maybe
yeah. I
coming?
mean, one of there are several Paraclete Press books that are coming up that I'm very excited about. And one is called The Prodigal of Leningrad, and it is by Daniel Taylor. So he was a English professor at Bethel College in the Twin Cities of Minnesota. And he wrote to me maybe 6, 8 months ago, I guess. And he said, "Would you mind reading this novel, and just let me know what you whether you think it's publishable or not." And I love Russian history and Russian fiction, as I mentioned earlier, Dostoevsky. And so Daniel sent me his manuscript, and I read it and immediately wrote back, "Of course, this should be published." And through a turn of events, help make some connections. And Paraclete is the one that's going to publish it, I believe, in January. So you could go to paracletepress.com and put in The Prodigal of Leningrad. Has an absolutely beautiful cover of a majestic, if any of you have been to St. Petersburg, a majestic building there, and just an incredible novel. So yeah, the little connection again, it's the attempt to build bridges between people and between companies.
Well, I wasn't sure I should ask you this quite yet, but since you brought up talking about this book of doubt in your book, and now his forthcoming novel with Paraclete, there's another Paraclete book that you know is coming out by another mutual friend. Steve Garber has a book coming out, and I know you know
Yeah.
and Steve and have mentioned some of his things. His book is coming in the new year, but I think they're shipping it. They said to me in December. It's called it's called Hints of Hope, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hints of Hope, Making Peace with the Proximate. I published three of Steve's books, I think, at IVP. I believe there were three. And yeah, thankfully, Paraclete's going to be publishing that. Has again a beautiful cover. Whoever is designing their books, I think, should win some awards from someone. And it has a foreword by the great artist Makoto Fujimura. And it's yeah, I've read that manuscript as well. Steve's a friend, and
You had published his Visions of Vocation, Common Grace for the Common Good. It has that beautiful Van Gogh cover.
yeah,
Um, in there, there's a chapter on being proximate, is the word he uses, that you just
right,
can't build God's kingdom on earth. Everything isn't going to turn out the way it ought to be in a fallen world. And so we should look for glimmers of hope where we can, and be grateful for the common grace that breaks out when it does. And to the extent that we can sort of be comfortable with the approximate, with getting
right,
just a bit, making the world a bit better, even if we don't solve all the problems of the world, that's sort of one of the ways in which we can develop the spiritual practice of longevity. We can hang in there without getting cynical or jaded if we have this sort of commitment to the proximate. And a lot of people talked about that chapter, and so this book is sort of an explanation of that one chapter in Visions of Vocation.
yeah. It's writing that concept large. But I think the other thing that Hints of Hope does is it's the most, I think it's the most personal of his four books. He shares quite a bit more of his own story, and I think that it's a really warm
Yeah.
book. So I would, yeah, I
Well,
would agree.
kudos
It's
to
kind
you
of
for helping him get over to Paraclete, and it's going to be published nicely. We have a bunch of pre-orders already on it. And this notion of hope and being written eloquently. I mean, you write about that too sometimes. And so let me just dive in and ask you sort of a couple of tough questions about the reading
okay.
world. How do you get people to want to read stuff that's maybe just a little deeper? I mean, I'm not talking about reading philosophy necessarily or the most deepest spiritual mystics of the medieval world. But how do you move people just from reading sort of more common inspirational things to maybe a little bit deeper? Somebody like Garber, somebody like Taylor. How do you get people? Your books are so warm and charming, and so they're easy to sell. How do you get people to buy books that maybe are just a little bit more meaty?
Well, if I knew a for sure answer to that question, I could probably become a well-paid consultant in the
Yeah.
publishing world. But the answer I would have is you tell stories, regardless of what the topic is. I mean, unless it's some, research dissertation or something, I understand. But I think even academic books can they can integrate an element of story or of narrative that I think warms up and makes more accessible that meat. And the extent, I mean, I can think of some scholars that I worked with at IVP Academic who did that. Gordon T. Smith,
Yeah.
probably someone
Yeah.
a book called Institutional Intelligence, and you may think, oh my goodness, that's going to be dry as stale toast. But he told stories about his journey as a president or a provost of large Canadian universities, and so it I think it opened it up to readers. So that I think that, and then the publishing houses that work in support of those books, telling the story well too, and thinking about design, the external design, the interior design. It's the whole package, Byron, that makes you know this as well as me. It's the whole package that makes a book approachable by the reader. And
And
so,
worth holding in your hand. If it does
yeah,
look pretty, it's not just sort of a sales marketing pitch, but to have a good item that is an artful piece to hold is itself a blessing. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. Word to the writers, word to the publishers, word to the marketers. We got to get the word out that good, even serious literature can be a joy to hold and read. But I guess where I was going with the question, Jeff, is what do people have to do to buckle down and want to read more? What do you say to the reluctant reader, to the person that says, I don't have the attention span anymore because the screens are distracting my attention. You know, the Nicholas Carr kind of concern that we're shallow now. How do you help people create space and desire to join a book club or something when they tend to be reluctant?
Well, I think that goes back to the chapter on reading as a spiritual discipline. And I
Yeah.
have what, 7 or 8 different things that I encourage people to think about. But it's you make time for it. You find, is your reading time the morning? Is it night? Or some other time? Is your reading time just the weekend? I mean, some jobs I understand can make the prospect of reading every day very challenging, but find a time, find a place. Um, I'm married to someone who reads, probably 8 books to my one. But I realize that's not always the case. So, within your own context, what are the rhythms of your family life if you live with someone that will allow the kinds of practical steps that I suggest in that chapter. But it's like any other discipline. You're making a commitment. It's important. There's a reason to do it, and you will find time to the things that are most important. And I would say audiobooks today. I wouldn't have said this 10 years ago. But I would say if you commute a lot, into a city or you travel on airplanes like I used to a lot. Consider audiobooks as a format. I elevate print. That's what I prefer. But audiobooks today are of such superior production quality than they were 10 years ago. I listened to Part of the Barn. I read the first 250 pages, and then I listened in the car on Saturday as I was making my way back from another bookstore. I listened to the last 150 pages. So I think that's another way. Make use of the time you have in the car or on
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
airplanes. So
Yeah. In your chapter, it's a very practical chapter, inspiring. I think you call them pathways, sort of
yeah.
pathways into the reading life, and convincing people that. One guy just made a comment here. A friend who's listening in said that pastors maybe need to encourage their church leaders and their people in their flocks to develop the reading life, maybe giving reviews and stuff. Of course, that's what I do in my book notes newsletter, and they're not always short, but I offer, left, right, and center, various perspectives, various topics, not always Christian books, but I try to give reviews of why Christians should care about these kind of books. But this commenter just said we have to get the word out to our people in our churches. And so we need to recruit pastors and Sunday school teachers and stuff to hold books up and encourage their people to read widely. I thank you for that comment. The listener doesn't say where they're from, but thank you for sharing that, because I think you're right. Church leaders need to get a vision for this kind of stuff.
Yeah,
Books
I
can
think
change people's lives. There's just no doubt about it, as can music. I mean, Jeff, your own conversion happened at that bookstore, right? Before you took it over and began to run it, didn't you come to a deeper faith in Christ through a Christian bookstore, right?
it was run by my wife's parents. Yes, they had a store on the west side of Indianapolis, and so I would say it was more of the place where the soil was watered, and
Yeah.
it was through both books and
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 music.
through music. In those days, just like
Yeah.
your store, I don't know if it still does, but the
Yep.
last time I was in, you had a lot of CDs. So the person who mentioned the church leader was actually a former bookseller in British Columbia. So you and he have a lot in common, Byron. It'd be good for you to get to know that person. But yeah, certainly. I mean, it was a church camp experience at the age of 15 that was kind of the point of change. But it was after meeting the woman who became my wife and beginning to go in their bookstore.
Yeah.
And also, they regularly sent me books up to the university dorm that I lived in, and I think they were wanting to make sure that I was properly tutored.
Good.
And
Well,
so,
good.
books
It
by John
worked.
Stott and Jim Sire and
Yep.
and people like that I ultimately wound up selling for IVP. So yeah, very important part of the story.
One of the chapters in your book, in that third section of reading through the seasons of life, doubt and grief and family life, when you have young kids, and there's so many good things on that these days, is the second to last chapter is reading in the seasons of the liturgical year. I adored this chapter, Jeff. Way to go. There's a whole lot of books on this. Bobby Gross, who you published, we did a book launch for him out here at Hearts and Minds in York when that his devotional around the liturgical year came out. I was with um, um, Diana Butler Bass just this
Yeah.
weekend, a very famous writer. She has a forthcoming book. We were the first bookstore to get it, so we were able to launch it there even before it came out. We got permission from the publisher. But that beautiful year, it's called, is about reading through the liturgical year, following the life of Jesus in that first season, of Advent in through the death of Jesus and Lent and Eastertide and so forth. And then that second half of the church calendar, which is sort of our response of living in ordinary time to the life of Jesus. And she talks about this rhythm and this circle instead of just sort of a straight line, a view of history that says, it's all going to end and God's going to blow up the planet and that's the end of that. So we should just
Yeah.
wait for the end. But rather we're in this rhythm of a circle of a year. And so that's what her new book is all about. I just thought I was literally, as I was listening to Diana talk this weekend about this forthcoming book, I was thinking of your chapter and how good it was and how many other books that she didn't allude to, that the other books that have been written about this. And so you've
Yeah.
added your chapter and then those 15 books to invite people into this reading about the liturgical year. Oh, I just said a bunch on that. What can you say to us to summarize that chapter? Why did you put that in there?
Yeah, well, I would say that Diana's book is one of them that had I had it before would have been on that list, and so it's one that will be added to the
Yeah.
evergreen on the website. I think it's just what when I came into the church, it was not one that observed the liturgical calendar. Um, I knew Lent, sort of. I knew Easter and Christmas. And so, but about 25 or so years ago, entered into a church that, that's what framed the worship. It's what framed the year. And so I just began reading as much as I could, both sort of dry, church resources on the subject to understand more, but then also works like Walter Wongren's Reliving the Passion,
Yeah.
for example, or Diana's new book would have been in that mix had it been out at the time. And I have found a great deal of solace and instruction by observing, the liturgical calendar. And I think it's because as one does that, we re-enter the story of Christ over again. Every year we're entering that story.
Yeah.
We're reliving that story, both the joys, the highs, the triumphs of the story, as well as the desolation. And so that's a spiritual formation idea that the desolations and consolations of one's life. And I think it brings us reading books like that. Bobby Gross's book that you mentioned is called Living the Christian Year. I assume that's the one you're
Yep.
talking about.
Yep.
Reading books like that just help us observe and to be mindful of both the desolations and
Yeah.
consolations of the
And it
year.
reminds us that the life of Jesus, and in fact, the whole biblical story, is not just a bunch of facts. He fed the 5,000 and he died on the cross. It's not like random little things, but it is a narrative itself. The Christian faith holds together as the drama of Scripture unfolds and as the life of Jesus is told. We're entering a narrative. So our own storied life makes sense. So the reading of novels, the reading of poetry, the reading of language that puts us into a literary mode helps us understand the Bible more. And I think embodying the liturgical cycle and the church calendar, I think just helps us do that. In the background of how we view
Yeah.
time, we're thinking of it as a story. So there's an interplay here between stories and novels and poetry and the way the liturgical calendar shapes us to inhabit time in that kind of literary way. So
Exactly.
yeah, I like that a lot. Hey, by the way, Jeff, you probably were the publisher when Bobby Gross did that wonderful book on InterVarsity Press on the church calendar. The
Correct.
preface of that is by Lauren Winner, who had a book on Paraclete, and Lauren Winner wrote just a couple of pages on why the church calendar matters to her as a growing Christian, a former Jew who became a Christian. I read that every single year. I don't read the whole Bobby Gross book, but I read her forward. I have it
Okay.
photocopied. And I dig that thing out and read it every single year as a spiritual practice. I adored those couple of pages of writing. It's funny how some writers just can print something so beautiful, and I want to
Yes.
keep coming back to it over and over again.
Well said. Yeah, I agree.
Eugene Peterson, in a collection of his, not his annotated bibliographies, but his book about, it's called Subversive Spirituality. It's just random essays and articles. And there's a couple on the role of novels and why pastors should read. And there's a piece in there about how Peterson was once reading a novel, and on about page so and so, his whole world opened up and he understood in a fresh way what it meant to be a pastor. He said he liked preaching, he liked administrating, he liked doing all kind of stuff in the church, but the actual pastoral work, he didn't do it all that well. He didn't care that much. It didn't stimulate him that much. And then while he was reading this Bloomsday story by James Joyce, this huge postmodern novel, on page such and such, a chasm opened up and he said, "This is what it means to be a pastor."
Yeah.
Do you have any books like that where you can name the day and the page you're on when everything just opened up and sort of transformed something in your life? I don't know if I have any that are just quite like that way, what James Baldwin called a punch to the solar plexus. But have you ever had any books like that that you just like were transformative in that moment?
Yeah, well, I mentioned The Admiral's Daughter in a certain way.
Yeah.
It had an effect like that, but probably not quite that dramatic. But I do tell the story, I believe, in World of Wonders about reading The Singer by Calvin Miller.
Oh, yeah, 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 you
It's
do.
an allegorical, like a retelling of the Gospel of Matthew. There was the singer and followed by the song and the finale. And I was reading that. I was in the early days of becoming a reader and was going on a family vacation with Cindy to northern Wisconsin. And that's the book I took along. Probably her mother gave it to me, or maybe she did. I'm not sure. But I think it was riding, in the back of an old blue Chevy van, reading Calvin Miller's The Singer, and just being so touched. I wish I had the book in front of me, even by the opening sentence. That I think by the time I was done with that, and maybe on the way back to Indiana from that vacation, I knew that I wanted to work with books.
Wow.
Um, and it probably was the seed that led to reopening that store in Bloomington.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. You mention a lot of books in here, and I like how you tell the stories behind them, um, and the story of your encountering them, and how other people encountered them. In the grief chapter, again, is such a good one. You tell the story that many of us know, but that C.S. Lewis had written the problem of pain, trying to figure out the problem of evil sort of abstractly as a young theologian. And then his wife died, new wife, and he wrote A Grief Observed.
Right.
And you mentioned in that book that he used a pseudonym. He didn't even want to write his own name because it was so vulnerable and full of lament. You didn't tell the story. I don't recall that you did, but it is said that then one of his friends saw this book by this guy with a fake name and thought, oh, C.S. Lewis would love this, and gave him his own book as a consolation to read and said, maybe this will help you. Little did he know that Lewis had actually written that book. But
Yeah, it was N.W. de Klerk, I think was the name on the original
yeah.
Grief Observed. That was the pseudonym he used, I believe.
And why did you say you thought it was good that he used a fake name, or why he was likely to do that? Just because it was so raw?
I think it allowed him because by then, I mean, that was one of his later books. By then he was this revered, Christian apologist with I mean, Mere Christianity came out of the BBC radio addresses, and he had the Narnian Chronicles, and I think it allowed him to be more real, um, to
Yeah,
not worry about reputation. It allowed him to be more raw.
yeah,
Um, I'm just trying to imagine if he had originally published it in his own name, what the people that I think by then he was at Cambridge University, not Oxford, but what others might have thought.
yeah.
But yeah, that's one of the most profound books I've ever read, A Grief Observed, for sure.
In a later edition, Madeline L'Engle um,
Right.
wrote a foreword, and you cite it here, in fact, on page 129. You say, writing of the impact of A Grief Observed in a foreword to a later edition of the book, author Madeline L'Engle wrote, and you quote her, I am grateful to Lewis for having the courage to yell, to doubt, to kick at God with angry violence. This is a part of healthy grief, not often encouraged. It is helpful indeed that C.S. Lewis, who has been such a successful apologist for Christianity, should have the courage to admit doubt about what had so supremely proclaimed. It gives us permission to admit our own doubts, our own angers and anguishes, and to know that that's part of the soul's growth. You go
Right.
on and say, reading in seasons of grief and loss can indeed be part of the soul's growth. I have seen that in my own life and the life of others who are part of my community of faith and my circle of friends, and in the life of my mother. And then you tell a story about your mom. I
Yeah.
just love the intimacy of this book, and I encourage people to read it and give it out to friends, even if they aren't big readers. Jeff, are there any special favorite parts you like in the book that you'd want to read? Could you share something with us in your own voice? A lot of
Yeah.
authors like to do that. Is there anything that stands out that you could share?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I think the chapter on reading in seasons of wonder and discovery is among my favorites. I'll not read a real long section, but it's really rooted in a book by a man named Arthur Gordon. He wrote a book called A Touch of Wonder. It was published in 1974. And there was kind of like the Grand Inquisitor section of Brothers Karamazov. There was one chapter called The Night the Stars Fell. And this is the beginnings, a quote from Gordon. One summer night in a seaside cottage, a small boy felt himself lifted from bed. Dazed with sleep, he heard his mother murmur about the lateness of the hour and heard his father laugh. Then he, the little boy, was borne in his father's arms with the swiftness of a dream, down the porch steps, out onto the beach. Despite the late hour and the awareness of a young boy's need for sleep, young Arthur's father knew a spectacular show was waiting, and there was wonder to be found. Undeterred, off they went into the blackness of the night. After they came to their seaside destination, this was just east of the city of Savannah, Georgia. Once they came to their seaside destination, Arthur looked into the overhead sky ablaze with stars. Watch, Arthur's father exclaimed, and incredibly, as he spoke, one of the stars moved. In a streak of golden fire, it flashed across the astonished heavens, and before the wonder of this could fade, another star leaped from its place, and then another, plunging toward the restless sea. What is it? The child whispered. Shooting stars, his father said. They come every year on certain nights in August. I thought you'd like to see the show. That image of father and son, I write, of stars falling from the sky, of bright encounters in a world of wonder they inhabited off the coast of Savannah in the 1920s, captivated me from the first time I read the book. I longed to be that kind of father, or now grandfather, to eschew things like bedtimes and family rhythms and, quote, sane decisions, unquote, in favor of stars and constellations, in favor of stories and wonder. I return to the pages of A Touch of Wonder every year, rereading and being drawn in as if for the first time, revisiting its pages and being filled with wonder once again and prompted to try my level best to never let the curiosity of childhood evaporate amid jobs and tasks and expectations and the aging process. It is my prayer for myself and for you that wonder and discovery are not simply a season, but a hallmark of our entire lives, from our first utterance of why as a small child until we take our last breath and all the seasons in between. I go on to talk about, is there, in a world as with as many cataclysms as we have, is it a good idea to, to be talking about a world of wonder, how can we do that? And I think, how can we not, even Frederick Buechner has a quote about, yes, this is the world. It is full of pain. It is also full of good things. And so, yeah, to nurture, even in the midst of all that's going on in this moment, even um, in Gaza, a ceasefire that seems to be breaking up, just days after it was set, and so much more. ICE in my home city here in Chicago, and things like that. Um, yeah, can we talk about wonder? Yeah, we must, and we have to hold on to that, even as we acknowledge the reality of the pain and the evil and the concerns of the world. So, we're not supposed to have favorite, grandchildren or favorite, uh, chapters of our books, but that's one of mine anyway.
It is a beautiful chapter, Jeff, and that's a beautiful reading. And you are so right. You have a chapter on reading diverse voices, which for many of us who are Anglo and white and male, we need to be reading women authors and people of color. You have a nice bibliography of some guides to reading Black literature, even. Uh, um, and so you're not unaware of the brokenness. You're not
Right.
unaware of the tragic. You have stuff about heavy novels like Dostoevsky, and you have this section on grief and loss, but that you ended it with this wonder section. Oh my, I didn't know you were going to read that part, but that is a beautiful way even to sort of bring the whole thing full circle, because reading books can help point us to that. I happen to myself love reading memoirs of the outdoors, people who just have a sense of wonder and the glory of creation. I go outside and I'm maybe tone deaf. Psalm
Yeah.
19 says the Lord is speaking through creation, and I don't hear it. So I got to read books of people that do to show me how. So I'm using, loving memoirs about the outdoors and books about people that capture wonder, like that great Star piece you just read. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're
Oh, this
welcome.
is a great, great book. We said we would go about an hour. Is there any other things you'd like to say about the book, Jeff, or anything you want to close with, or any reading you'd like to do further? You have a section on poetry. There's so much in this. What good words might you have for us as we begin to sort of bring this to a close? Nobody has any other questions here that I can read. Lots of good comments, but nobody's
Yeah.
asking anything specific. So I'll ask you, what do you want to say here yet at the end?
Yeah, well, I think what I tried to do with this book, yeah, it is filled with stories. It is very general interest level. This isn't an academic treatise on reading. There are quite a few of those. What I hope I have done with the help of my editor at Paraclete Press and the editor I have, my first editor who is here in my house, my wife Cindy, on anything I do. What I hope we've done is meet you wherever you are on the continuum of readership, from a voracious reader like Byron and Beth Borger, to someone who maybe only occasionally picks up a book when they go on vacation or something like that. I hope that I've met you wherever you are on that continuum, and that I can bring you along, that the list of books, even if it's just, a title or an author, oh, I didn't know that person had another book, that I can bring you along to cultivating a reading life. You mentioned C.S. Lewis earlier, in the movie Shadowlands, which portrayed the relationship to Joy Davidman, the woman he ultimately married, but who died shortly thereafter, which led to a grief observed. There's a classic scene where Anthony Hopkins, who played Lewis, was with in his tutoring room with one of his students at Oxford at Magdalen College. And Lewis says to the young man, he says, "We read to know we're not alone. Do you agree?" Now, there's no evidence that Lewis ever actually said that. He said something close to it in Experiment in Criticism,
Yeah.
but he didn't say exactly those words. But I remember being in the theater with a couple of friends when it came to that. I remember tears filling my eyes because I think for me, it does characterize in some way what reading is. I read to know I'm not alone. I read to know what I think. I read to be challenged about what I think. And I think in the moment and time that we're in, I think there are a lot of us who feel, at least maybe should just speak for myself, but I suspect I'm not alone in feeling at times, and particularly in the evangelical world that I've been a part of, feeling like I'm alone. Like, am I the only one who is feeling this way or seeing these things this way? And I just think books, they come alongside me and they say, no, you're not.
Yeah.
You're not alone. And they've become companions on my journey. And so I guess I would close with, I think that's been true for you, Byron. I know you well enough to know that's true for you. And I think it can be true for all of us, even if we don't sense that now, if we devote a bit of time to cultivating a discipline of reading, I suspect that you will sense too. Uh, you're not alone. You have companions on the journey, and it will be well worth your investment of time. So,
Wow, Jeff.
yeah,
Beautiful, beautifully put. You're not the only one. You're not alone. And there are many of us cheering for you at this point. There's other booksellers that are cheering from you. We hope people will order the book through our website and course. But in the inside of the book, there's people that have endorsed this, and that's common practice with books. But can I just read one of them? This is by Warren Farha, who
yeah,
has the very famous Eighth Day books. It's the bookstore we'd like to be when we grow up, out in Wichita, Kansas.
Wichita,
And
Kansas. Yeah,
Warren writes this, and he quotes the C.S. Lewis line that you quote. So let me just read this from Warren. He says, Jeff Crosby appropriately begins his exploration of reading with a quotation from C.S. Lewis's brilliant Experiment in Criticism, which, with the perceptive precision of typical Lewis, perfectly describes why we read. And you quote Lewis, and he cites you here. We want to see with others' eyes, to imagine with others' imaginations, to feel with others' hearts, as well with our own.
yeah,
World of Wonders is intended to help us do just that. Despite his immersion in every aspect of book reading and publishing, Jeff is an unintimidating, disarmingly gentle, and humble guide for readers of every level of proficiency and every type of reading intention, whether it's for sheer entertainment or the deepest spiritual discipline. And don't miss the dozen reading lists reflecting decades of experience as a veteran reading and publisher. Pure gold, he says. I just think this is just lovely, Jeff. When Wendy Murray is a friend of yours and a woman that's written books on Claire, and Francis has a new book out on inner healing on Paraclete Facts. She says Crosby's book not only traces the way the magic of reading captured his own imagination, setting him on a lifelong career in the book industry. More than that, his exploration of reading as an act of worship, as a form of liturgy, even as a spiritual discipline, summons all of us, calling us forth from the frenzy and fragmentization of modern life to the sacred and healing ground of getting lost in a book. It's a stream of shining waters for a fatigued and thirsty soul.
uh,
She says it just right. And there's
yeah,
so many others. And there's people commenting here in our chat that's coming in of people that say they love this conversation. They loved you. One woman says she's read the book already and she just loved it. So you're getting a lot of kudos. Let's hope people order this thing. We have them at 20% off. We're going to put a slide up on the screen when we leave from Paraclete, but it links you to the Hearts and Minds website. You can join our book notes newsletter, and we can send them right out, carefully wrapped. We got a stack of them here. We're happy to do that. And Jeff, it's an honor to hang out with you a little bit and talk again about your love of reading.
Thank
World
you,
of
Byron.
Wonders, A Spirituality of Reading by Jeff Crosby, officially released tomorrow. It's $18.99. We have it at 20% off at Hearts and Minds. Kudos to Paraclete. Kudos to you, Jeff. Say hi to your wife, Cindy, Beth and I, and all of us here in South Central Pennsylvania. Thank you for this time, and we hope it's helpful to all of you that are listening. Let's do it again. If I may say,
Yeah.
I am going to have another webinar just like this next Monday night with Kathleen Norris to celebrate her InterVarsity book about her handicapped sister called Rebecca Sue. So InterVarsity is going to be hosting us next week. If anybody's interested, they can sign up at Hearts and Minds for that, and we'll have some time with the great Kathleen Norris, a writer, Jeff, that I'm sure you esteem as well as we do. So thanks for your work. Thanks for being here. Thanks for tonight. I'm going to sign off, and we thank everyone for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Byron. Take care.
Appreciate it.